So this is 08:33, just short of 08:34 hours GMT on Saturday, the 5th of September 2020. And this is coming from London, UK, and is representing the exclusive original investigation and research and analysis on the state of corrupt regime fronted by Boris Johnson, the corrupt regime. There have been other corrupt regimes fronted by others, and representing the divide, so-called political party divide. But essentially, the establishment of the quote British state, as it still is, the establishment, that is the structure, that is the orientation, the role, the propensity. And one of the supporters of the conservative or the Tory ideology from the judiciary, I have shown this cover more than once, I think, on this channel. And this is, I call him Tom Denning. Lord is an unacceptable word for a human being to be used because there is no Lord but God. I mean, I believe in that. So I don't believe in that in a fanatical way, but objectively, I believe in the only Lord is God. So no human being can be a Lord. That would be totally unacceptable according to the belief, which will be sharing the status and the title with God, letting somebody share it. So that's a shirk. And this is something that I am making quite clear as the reason for my opposing the use of Lord, either House of Lords, which I prefer to call House of Peers, or even worse, and the Lord Justice and Lord this, that, and the other. And if I have to use those under the formalities in the judicial bureaucracy, then I would prefer to have the option to use the quotation marks, so that that is qualified as not my choice or my acceptance. So Tom Denning was one of the main kind of conservatives with a small c and probably the big C, but essentially small c. And Tom Denning was made the kind of figurehead chair or leader of the inquiry into the Profumo scandal in the early 1960s. And that was based on the decision by the Tories and the cons to penalize the victims of the corrupt conservative regime. And the victims, of course, were highlighted and personified by Christine Keeler. She was the main victim, and of course her friend, the osteopath who committed suicide under pressure. Now, Tom Denning came to international news fame based on his being chosen to inquire into the scandal. And the scandal was, I mean, he didn't really find anything wrong with the Tories. I mean, essentially, he exonerated them. And that is where one of his most discreditable roles have to be found. Otherwise, he has been a prolific commentator or commenter or dissenter from other so-called members of the judiciary in the upper echelon where he belonged. And there has developed a kind of cult in some quarters around Tom Denning. And I have been fascinated by Denning right from the beginning, right from 1963, when he actually visited Dhaka, then in East Pakistan, and now in the capital of Bangladesh now. I studied the kind of praise sung for him by a publication that was published, I think, with the patronage, financial patronage of the then government or the government establishment of Pakistan. And it is subject to verification, but I think that was very much patronized by the government, even if not allowed to act as a spokesperson platform for the government. And it was called The Detective, the magazine. Either it was a weekly, I think it was a weekly. I could be wrong because it was a long time ago, but it could be The Detective fortnightly or monthly, I don't know, but it is subject to verification. But whatever the frequency, it was called The Detective, and The Detective ran comprehensive, almost verbatim, kind of quotes from Tom Denning, who was visiting. And Tom Denning was visiting not for any judicial reason. He was already a member of the High Court judicial bureaucracy, but he was there as part of the propaganda operated by the then conservatives still in power. And I remember the praise of him. I don't remember the actual phrases, but the praise, the profile, he was promoted as very kind of intelligent, and he was promoted as being fair and bright and all the other things. So all these years later, that was 17 years later, I think, when I met him at the launch of this book, at a launch or signing event at an address at the corner of the corner of Chancery Lane and Fleet Street. And so when he signed the copy that I had bought or I was buying, he was speaking to almost everyone short and brief words. So he asked me where I was from. So I said Bangladesh, and quick as a flash, he kind of rebutted it and he said East Pakistan. Now that was 1980, so it was kind of 9 years since East Pakistan ceased to be, but he remembered it as East Pakistan. And I noticed his memory. That is quite remarkable. So Denning, in his Discipline of Law, that is his first published book as such, and this was published around the time he was going or had just gone, retired. And the circumstances surrounding his retirement may be coincidental, but the circumstances were not favorable to him as a member of society, as a member of the, quote, civilized kind of judiciary, because he had been involved in a racist comment or opinion he had expressed, or he had been reported as having expressed at that time or shortly before that. This is, now I'm talking about quite a while ago. It's sort of 40 years ago almost, So therefore, 90, 2000, 2010, and 40 years ago. So I have to check what the actual circumstances and the allegations against him were about racism. But he was embroiled in the kind of allegation as happened because it was in the paper. So all of this I'm saying because of the natural justice, where this edition of the book, page 84, numbered as number 2, is on the other points on tribunals, and he's talking about tribunals. Now I'll come to that because this is the diagnosis of the media, Fleet Street, and I diagnose its original world exclusive diagnosis. So therefore I don't read headlines as such for the sake of it. But I diagnose and I give the introduction to the original empirical investigation and other evidence. Now I'll come to why I'm talking about natural justice and why I'm talking about tribunals. I'll come to that in examining the latest corruption and criminality, illegality by local councils, and the two that I have been examining extensively and with dedicated empirical involvement so that no one can say it's third-party source or anonymous source. Empirical. Go and look it up. Empirical means I've been engaged, absolutely engaged, intentionally and otherwise. I've been engaged in confronting the liars in Tower Hamlets Council and the liars in Newham Council. And I'll come to that. Now, this is what is contained in Tom Dunning's book. So I'm quoting that in the first person he's writing. I have spent much time on error of law by a tribunal, but very little time on want of natural justice or bias and the like. The reason is because these have given rise to no controversy. It is beyond doubt that if a tribunal fails to observe the rules of natural justice or is biased, its decision is a nullity and void, and it can be quashed on certiorari. That's a Latin word, certiorari. However I'm pronouncing it is certiorari, or declared void by a declaration to that effect. Sufficient to illustrate this is Khanda versus Government of Malaya. And I'll stop there because Khanda and Malaya, this is a kind of throwback to the imperialist role of the British judiciary over Malaysia, whatever. That is not the point of my actual reference to the natural justice bit by Tom Dunning. Tom Dunning is absolute fantasist. There is no evidence in that quotation that I have just read that he knows or he knew or understood real life. He says, he said the reason is that it is beyond doubt that if a tribunal fails to observe the rules of natural justice or is biased, its decision is a nullity and void, and it can be quashed on certiorari or declared void by a declaration to that effect. That presumes, that is absolutely based on the strongest presumption that the victim of a tribunal's idiocy, injustice, wrongness, and wrongfulness is capable of seeking justice or redress through this process. And certiorari is not available just from any court. It has to be sought in the High Court and what is now called the judicial review process. All of these are obstacles created in a way that makes it physically, humanly impossible for most victims of judicial corruption, criminality, and bias, unable to access the so-called remedy against that kind of bias and injustice. So Tom Denning was completely on another planet. And I'll come to that again in talking about NEOM. Now, NEOM Council, which is fronted by the crook Roxana Fias now, was fronted by the crook Robin Wales for 16 years as the elected executive mayor. These elected executive mayors are a liability against democracy, against basic common sense, basic delivery of ordinary, just and efficient and fair service to the people in the communities they correspond to and they cover and they represent supposedly, or they exist in the name of. In fact, they exist at the expense of. Now, the NEOM Council hasn't got any system in place where a victim of their lying and unfairness can seek redress without having to wait inordinate and oppressive amount of time for an external adjudication process. That entails any number of quote professionals and other people to be engaged, which is not physically, materially possible. Most of the times, the injustice and the wrongful behavior and the bias perpetrated by a local council, such as NEOM London East Borough Council, they don't receive any fairness ruling in their favor against the injustice. They have to suffer the injustice for the rest of their time. And that is what is happening in this case, where the people in a team called Housing Benefit Team made a decision and they lied. Essentially, the details will be too boring. So they lied and they said that they couldn't pay the housing benefit for a tenant in a private kind of tenancy, which in the case of private tenancy, it's called local housing allowance. It's the same principle, but it is slightly different because it's private landlords are paid the local housing allowance through the tenancy of the tenant in their property. And if the quote landlord, and I'm saying the Lord is the within quotation marks, and throughout it should be understood that whenever the word Lord is part of any sentence or any statement, I am saying that within the quotation marks and the condition that I set out at the beginning, that it's blasphemy and it's shirk and is sharing the entity and the status of God with another person. So the landlord is a linguistic continuation of the corrupt history of the ownership of quote land and interest in land, etc., that goes back hundreds of years. And so the landlord is an evidence. The word landlord is evidence of the severe restriction on the human rights, the civil liberties and freedom of the people who are using the land as tenants or as other occupants without any legal rights or legal kind of claims on the quote land. So if the quote landlord is private landlord and not the council, then the equivalent of the housing benefit paid for that tenancy is called local housing allowance. Now I'm doing this analysis, and this one is another original world exclusive report on the state of the stupidity called the local housing allowance. I have investigated with the House of Parliament, that is House of Commons, and they've got a thing called the inquiry, information, whatever. They haven't produced any answer as to the so-called briefing document about what is housing, local housing allowance. What they have is completely unrelated to reality on the ground. As most of the briefing papers produced by the UK House of Commons or the UK Parliament, these are artificial, shallow, and do not relate to real lives. And I'll say why they don't, and how they don't, and how they are as unreal as the members of Parliament. I have asked the same people through my campaigning organization outfit and my kind of students, current students, let's say. I have had students for decades, de facto, and I have current set of students doing the work and in the remote kind of mode, have asked questions that I have framed and I have actually drafted in effect as to what the MPs are obliged to do when they get elected. What are their duties to the constituents? And the amazingly, absolutely typically stupid answer is that the MPs don't have to do anything effectively. In other words, the MPs don't have an obligation to communicate directly to people who are called constituents, that is, people living in the constituency of the MPs. And the MPs do not have to answer communications, questions, demands, whatever, put to them by a constituent or a number of constituents. So that means that there is a vacuum for the period between two elections where MPs can do whatever they like and the constituents are left at the mercy of the MP who may deign, D-E-I-G, and deign to engage with them, or they may defy them. Now, this is the state of democracy, which is why I call it dumbocracy. Because most people in most constituencies and most electors are treated as dummies and dumb and stupid. And the evidence of that is because there is no revolution. During an encounter I had in the 1970s at a university law faculty with a kind of academic law, constitutional law academic lecturer. And he said, boastfully, this idiot said that there had been no turmoil, there had been no revolution in Britain, so there is a lot of stability in various things. And I am saying, and I told the moron, that that is absolute rubbish, because the system of imperialism that dominated so many countries in Africa and Asia for so many hundreds of years was actually transferred the culture and the norms and the presumptions back to Britain and used against ordinary British people, their so-called British citizens. God, I mean, what a myth that is British citizens. Now, these people have been treated with as much contempt by the establishment as the establishment have treated the people in Africa and Asia and other, quote, colonies. And what I was outraged by on the evidence, not because the idiot was an idiot, but it was the idiotic evidence, because the reason why there were no upheavals or revolutions, as he was putting them, was because these imperialists at home, the empire codes were applied and they were suppressing all tendencies of revolution and upheaval. It's one thing to say there has been no revolution, but it is another thing to say why and how the revolutions were suppressed and how brutally they were suppressed. I mean, the events of Peterloo 200 years or so ago and other places show that there have been severe, merciless kind of repression used to suppress the tendencies. And Orgreave in the miners or mine workers revolt against Thatcher, the same tactics were used. And the evidence is that the Labour Party, so-called, in the 1980s and even now, the Labour Party is not any longer anything to do with the founding aims of the party. And it wasn't in the 1980s. And the so-called Communist Party and other so-called left outfits are totally infantile and idiotic. So when a right-wing academic, constitutional law academic, boasts that there has been no kind of turmoil and revolution, unlike mainland Europe, there have been no revolution on the British Isles for hundreds of years, he is lying by taking for granted the agreement with that lie of all the political parties in Britain. And that is not at all the same thing as what he was saying, because he was himself basing his boast and idiocy on the assumption that there would be no credible challenge to his assumption, which was a borrowed assumption because it was continuing assumption. And that is where I have to refer to all these Russell Group universities and Oxbridge and all the others that are sold as the sources of the world's highest and best academic standards and all the rubbish. Now, the universities have not produced one single instance where they have actually exposed the corruption that I have been narrating and relating and updating on and diagnosing every day. Tinkering, the tinker and the tickle, but they don't actually examine the evidence of the corruption, the criminality, and the, of course, racism. And what is happening with the Denning claim about tribunals being open to being kind of exposed and quashed, tribunal decisions quashed, and their decision being made void and nullity is not true, because Newham Council, during the time of Robin Wales, had employed a team of housing benefit employees, in-house, full-time employees, who conspired to invent an excuse in order to deny a private private property renter, the full amount of the local housing allowance, which is at that time was about £180 at 2016 prices, which is the rate that the Newham Council decided was valid at the time for the maximum local housing allowance. But by inventing a lie against the particular tenant, they reduced that, they halved it. They reduced it to one half of that. And the lie they invented was completely untrue on the facts in 2016 as it is now. They said that the particular tenant shared the kitchen with other people who lived in the same flat, but not in the same room. And that's not true. That was not true then, and that's not true now. And they have been lying for the now 4 years plus few months. So that was Robin Wales. And Wales was replaced in May 2018 by Roxana Fias. And she has continued to refuse to withdraw the lie perpetrated against the particular tenant by the employees of the NEOM Council. So for 4 years and 2 months or 3 months, the NEOM Council administration has been perpetrating a lie, wanton lie, saying that the particular tenant shared the kitchen with the other tenants, which the tenant did not and could not and would not. So those are the details, but the essential fact is that there was no evidence that they did or they could or they had been. In fact, there is evidence from the beginning of the tenancy in correspondence exchanged between the tenant and the other people who were already in residence at the same address, that the particular tenant would not share the kitchen with them. So it was in advance of the particular tenant moving into the property that the tenant had said they would not share the kitchen. So that is fact, that is not law. That is fact, and that has been the fact. So in the time, the last 4 years and 3 months, the tenant has had reason to demand evidence from NEOM Council. And there has been no evidence because there cannot be. It is physically impossible to produce evidence showing that the tenant shared or was sharing the kitchen with the other people. So this was something that was not a matter of law, because the tenant challenging the lie was not challenging any aspect of the law, because the law did not say, and the law cannot say, and the law will not say that any council or any person can invent a lie and then claim it to be law. That is the point. So NEOM Council allowed these liars in place in the housing benefit section to say that the particular tenant was sharing the kitchen, which was not anything to do with the law. The tenant challenging that lie was not challenging any law that allowed any allocation of any particular sum or proportion or ratio of the local housing allowance if the facts were true. Now, in this case, the facts were distorted by the employees, and the employees' names have been repeatedly mentioned to Roxana Fias and others concerned, including to the Unison man called John Gray. Now, John Gray is a Welshman who has become a kind of white advantager for Roxana Fias, because she relies on him more than she relies on any Asian or African person on the face of it. She does have Asian and African, quote, colleagues or co-plotters, as Gillard has claimed in his book published in 2018, that Fias had been plotting since 2013 with a number of people that included John Gray and an African woman or a couple of African councillors. But in the case of the lying invented by the housing benefit employees, Fiaz has refused to answer the challenge that she should produce evidence, or the council should produce evidence, as has Gray. And they know that they're lying. And the reason why they're lying, and they're confident that their lies, their denials, would be allowed to carry on without them having to be held to account for their collusion, complicity, and post facto, that is, after the lying decision was first made, post facto approval and complicity with the liars, because there is no accountability and there is no system in place within the judiciary that would air the truth, and air the truth both for the sake of the truth and the sake of fairness. And the local ombudsman that is in place supposedly to consider, investigate, adjudicate on complaints against local councils made by local people is completely unfit for purpose. It makes occasional ritualistic statements, but they don't uphold anything of any substance against most of the wrong decision-making personnel in the council and in favor of the people whose rights have been violated, whose lives have been totally messed up and destroyed, and who have been robbed, in effect, of years of their life and more. So this is the exclusive diagnosis of the media, because the local media, the Newham Recorder, whose owner has just sold the whole group to another company, 90% of it, so-called. I discussed the Archant in the diagnosis of Fleet Street yesterday. I discussed it about for 40 minutes, exclusive discussion based on evidence gathered in Newham and in East London and elsewhere, and in my exclusive analysis about the stupidity of the current editor of East London Idiotizer and Newham Recorder. I have given details, so I don't need to go over the details again here, except to say that when the editor, the current editor of the Newham Recorder and the East London Idiotizer, was told about Newham Council lying against a particular tenant and robbing the tenant of the local housing allowance amount that they were owed and they were entitled to on the facts, this editor said that they didn't have any staff to report on this. Now, anyone with any common sense would know that if the evidence is there, and this editor was asked to put those facts, those allegations to Newham Council. And she refused to do that because she said there were no staff around. That was not necessary, because the challenge had been already made to Newham Council many times, and the challenges were not taken up by the liars, Roxana Fiaz and John Gray the liar. So therefore that evidence exists and existed at the time that this particular editor was contacted about this particular incident of lying. And she refused to look at the evidence. So what extremely unique, intellectual, rigorous content would a reporter bring to the issue? None, nothing. In fact, what this editor was told was 20 times quality-wise, fact-wise, evidence-wise, law-wise, 20 times better quality than all the Newham Recorder reporters' contributions about Newham Council in the last 18 years amounted to in terms of principle, in terms of the quality, as I say. So this is the reason why Matthew Kelly, who was the digital content editor of the Archan group until he resigned earlier from that post, Matthew Kelly is the person who was the first editor of the New European, the anti-Brexit outlet, which was published from Archan as well. It's a commercial arrangement, not out of charity. So Matthew Kelly said a few months ago, at the beginning of this year, in a statement that was published in the UK Press Gazette, which is known as pressgazette.co.uk, that most of the local titles, like the New York Recorder, like the East London Idiotizer, but they have got other titles locally as well, Archan controlled at the time, they don't have any right to be funded to be in publishing if they don't serve the community, if they're not interesting enough, if they don't contribute enough materials. Words to the effect, any need to fact check the contents, actual quotation from Matthew Kelly, I will be quite happy to recall them in time and at the appropriate time. But so the reason why he was saying that he was scaling down and the local papers were being scaled down was evident in the behavior of this editor. And as I said yesterday, this editor of the New York Recorder and the East London Idiotizer has been a, quote, journalist since the 1980s. That is the depth of our stupidity and our ignorance. Now, if that is the case, somebody who has been in journalism, within quotes, for almost 40 years is so stupid that she repeatedly refused to look at the evidence of serious miscarriage and robbery by Newham Council crooks. And so Newham Council's corruption continues unabated to this day as far as Roxana Fiers and John Gray are concerned, and as far as their monitoring officer, Newham Council's monitoring officer, is a notorious person in terms of his role. Not notorious, I'm not saying he is notorious because of his personal characteristics. I don't know him personally. And this comment is not made about him personally. I don't know anything about his personal life or whatever. But I do know his role as an employee in the legal kind of capacity or capacity as a lawyer, in my definition, licensed law trader in Walthamstow or Waltham Forest Council before, and currently in Newham, for the last few years in Newham. And because of Jan Hislop's kind of policy of tickling the councils, not really rigorously going to town with investigation into them, Private Eye, the Rotten Boroughs page or column, just hinted at this character, Daniel Fanwick. Didn't actually elaborate on his role, but kind of hinted at a sinister kind of profile and controversial profile. But that's not going anywhere near the truth about how seriously involved and how deeply involved in corruption of the council Daniel Fanwick has been. Now, Fanwick told a member of the staff in the Newham Council's so-called democratic services, which comes under the so-called directorate of the so-called chief executive. Now, he said to the assistant director of democratic services, or assistant director in charge of the democratic services, so-called, that continuing correspondence about this issue should be kind of treated as being now handled by him, and no other member of staff in the Niyam Council should deal with any queries or communications on that particular issue or that particular scandal or case. Now, that was at least 6 weeks ago. And it came to my investigation team and our knowledge about 4 weeks ago, I think, when Fenwick was said to be preparing a letter, not email, a letter, presumably by post. And it was claimed on his say-so, I'm absolutely certain, that he, Fenwick, was gathering all the materials and information in order to answer the questions. Now, the questions have been on the basis of the investigation that I have been supervising, in addition to the other inputs that I have already outlined and explained. There are about 100 questions that Niyam Council has been asked about all kinds of things related, interrelated, interlinked with that issue and other corruption and criminality and abuse and conspiracies that have been allowed to be perpetuated and perpetrated by Niyam Council directly and via the employees in the posts. So when Tom Dunning says the tribunals, if they are in law, are in law, they make a mistake in law, that can be set aside he didn't say the words, but that is what he meant, judicial review, certiorari. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation almost accurate. Certiorari is not a word that comes into the daily vocabulary in the English language. So I'm not alone. I think most people would be unfamiliar with the exact authentic kind of pronunciation of certiorari. But certiorari, just to get the accuracy of the meaning, I will look it up and say what certiorari is. So this is a seminar. This is a diagnosis of the Fleet Street Papers, but it's a seminar on law, constitution, democracy, and the mayoral system and all the other things. And the linguistic. All right, certiorari, in the legal sense when it's used, is a noun, a writ or order by which a higher court reviews a case tried in a lower court. And a type of writ meant for rare use by which an appellate court decides to review a case at its discretion, the appellate court's discretion. The word certiorari comes from Low Latin and means to be more fully informed. A writ of certiorari orders a lower court to deliver its record in a case so that the higher court may review it. Writ of certiorari, yes, is one of the court's rules for granting certiorari requires that the appellant, the person or persons appealing the case, have standing to do so, meaning that he or she would be directly affected by the court's decision. And so that is locus standi and all the other Low Latin words. So certiorari is a writ that is effectively an order to the lower court, etc. But this higher court, the appellate court, is actually a high court. It's not a county court that can do the kind of decision review that the certiorari kind of involves and entails. Now, sartorieri and Bolson and Trails. Now, what happened in Newham is that instead of withdrawing their lies, the decision maker, a woman called Watson, she said at the beginning of the kind of week in September 2017, when the hearing was due to take place at a tribunal, that she, Watson, could change the decision and pay the tenant the full amount of the local housing allowance. She said that. But she said also that she would not do that. She could do that, but she would not do that, which means that she was not legally acting when she had upheld her co-conspirators' decision to lie, invent the lie. So come to that. Now, where is the tribunal coming from? The tribunal was the place where they, Newham Council lawyers, referred the case, not the claimant, not the tenant. And they did that. What they did that, and it was kind of staged, the so-called hearing before a racist woman tribunal quote judge. The stage was, it was enacted, if you like, in September 11th of September 2017. So either on the morning of 11th of September or a few working days before that date, this Watson person confessed that she could withdraw the lie. She didn't say lie, but obviously she could change the decision, but she wasn't going to. Now that showed that she was determined to rob the tenant of the benefit that they were entitled to, and they were being robbed by criminals. Robbed of by criminals. Now, that tribunal staging was done 13 months after the liars actually had conspired to invent the lie and not pay the tenant the local housing allowance, the full local housing allowance. What is 13 months? Anyone remotely familiar with homelessness should think about this. What can 13 months of rent money not being paid to the tenant who should pay the full amount of rent to their rent giver, if you like, the rent tenancy manager or person who they have rented the property from. I'm trying to avoid using the word landlord within quotation marks. Even 13 days of not paying the full amount can cause serious nightmare situation against the tenant. Most people who demand payment of rent in the private sector or even in the council sector, and discussing the council, we shall be discussing tower hamlets, because that is where the most extensive series of criminality took place against council tenants. But back to Newham, and what they did was the 13 months, they kept the case waiting for 13 months, and then there was this so-called hearing that was staged in September, 11th of September 2017. And the hearing was staged because the tribunal so-called judge was an absolute idiot. She didn't know the law, and she most certainly didn't give anything to the impact of somebody being lied about and being denied the local housing allowance for any length of time. And what happened was that there was no person appearing at the staged hearing from Newham Council to be interrogated by the claimant or by the tenant. So what a stupid, absolute stupid farce. Now that is what is going on in real life across the country in England. And when I say that local councils create homelessness, that is what I mean. It is not the legal power of the land owner or the freeholder or leaseholder, whatever the quote landlord has as their status in terms of interest in land, that is the legal expression. They cannot make it legal to just say to a tenant to leave and then say, that's it, I told them to leave and that's it. They have to go through the legal process, and often it is the county court. So when the application is made for what is called possession order, eviction is called possession order, it is granted by the county court. That has been the history. And so when, for example, I'll find Polly Toynbee. When Polly Toynbee wrote a typical Polly Toynbee piece in The Guardian, I will go through that. On 2nd of February, Polly Toynbee at 6 o'clock GMT, that is in the morning, 7 o'clock local time, I think, she wrote, "A day in court showed me the misery of Britain's housing policy." Now that headline is completely untrue because she didn't describe any misery. She, in fact, praised the kind judge and the solicitors and the shelter, and she didn't actually go through the reality of what actually happens in court. And she didn't talk about the lack of say allowed to the victim tenants targeted for eviction, who are not given the full say or any say by the corrupt judiciary or judges in the county courts or the system there. And Polly Toynbee is totally ignorant about the councils. And when she was, and she relates to all the trendy items like Benefit Street and the other things. But when she was, I had my kind of investigatory team ask her questions at the time, immediately after she wrote that stupid piece. She went to Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court. I am very familiar with the crooks in the Clerkenwell and Shoreditch Crooked Court. I have been for a very long time over many issues. And what she did was leave out the role of the councils completely. And she praises shelter. And she praises the kind judge. And she doesn't say what the routine is, how 98% or even higher number of people who are subjected to losing their homes and their lives and the livelihoods and their health are treated. And this is something that we raised, my investigation team raised with Polly Toynbee, and she said she didn't cover most of the stuff because she didn't have the resources. Now, Polyton B is one of the most corrupt beneficiaries of the arrangement between the establishment in the government circles, whatever, and the Guardian type and the platform. She is more successful than Janet Street Porter in using her gender, using her kind of race, and using her bourgeois kind of background and location to create a so-called niche spot for herself as a commentator. But she does disservice. She does disservice to the cause of truth and fact, as does Janet Street Porter. And these people are part of the sickness of the lying Fleet Street. The diagnosis of Fleet Street comes into that. And so what happened in the tribunal with the judge, so-called, looking at the pile of paper submitted or given it by Neom Council's liars, was to say that the law says this, law says that. But that is not what the issue is. The issue is that they lied about the fact. They said that the tenant shared a kitchen, which is the center of the dispute and the challenge between the tenant and the lying council. The tenant never challenged the legality of any decision that fitted the facts. This one never fitted the facts, never would fit the facts because the facts were not there. So where do people go when the law is not involved but lying is involved? And the court can only deal with the law, as Tom Dunning said. If they erred in law, E-R-R-E-D, erred in law, then a certiorari can be done and all the rest of it. And Tom Dunning totally failed to anticipate the behavior of this so-called judge or the behavior of the liars in Neom Council. So the fact that he didn't actually feature, or his kind of musings and his outpourings and contributions did not cover natural justice is not an accident, because Tom Dunning lived in a fantasy world in that respect. And what I'm saying now, that is Dunning talking about the 70s, let's say. That book was published in the 80s, beginning of the 80s, so 1980. So he was talking about the 60s and 70s. In the 40 years since Dunning looked at anything like the tribunals and the court system bureaucratically have gone through various redesign, renaming, and all the rest of it. But essentially, the culture of illegality in the legal system, illegality by the legal system, by the bureaucracy, and the culture of denial of human rights and the right to say and the right to fair trial and fair hearing to most people affected by the wrongdoings of councils, of the legal bureaucracy itself, and other authorities and agencies of the state. That has not only got worse, but it is now at a dangerously kind of fragile, volatile state, because the battle for a career by kind of legal aid that the licensed law traders have lost has also adversely affected a lot of people who kind of relied on the licensed law traders. And so therefore the access to the court bureaucracy for seeking redress against council criminality and council corruption has been reduced significantly. And what I am saying here is that it's not just Tom Dunning. The current correspondence or his counterparts in the posts now in the High Court are as prejudiced against civil liberties, basic human rights, and legality and the legal redress as any to be found in the worst possible jurisdiction where there is no rule of law. Natural justice, due process, rule of law. These are phrases that are claimed to be phrases taken from the best legal system in the world, which is the British one, which is a myth and a fantasy. But these things are practiced and these are kind of rehearsed routinely to sell, to make it marketable, anything British like British law and whatever. So Napoleon was right, and they're selling stuff that are not kind of merchantable or merchandisable. So what is happening here is that he has got various successors in the Queen's Bench Division, which is the biggest kind of court structure because it contains so many different courts, including defamation, libel, and judicial review as well. The jurisprudence, well, there is a semi-industry in place in the name of Tom Denning. It's called the Denning jurisprudence. Now, the Denning jurisprudence is kind of overhyped and overstated. It's not as intellectually, rigorously, morally, ethically good as it is painted to be. But the ordinary jurisprudence contains no evidence that the British judicial industry and bureaucracy has been complying with the many terms of the treaties, the conventions, the charters, the agreements that I have been talking about in almost all these editions. And so therefore, the contents of the decisions are in violation of the international treaties, charters, agreements, and conventions. And that is where the newspapers, the media, the BBC and the ITV and Channel 4, as I said, as a campaigner to found Channel 4, I have a particular awareness of what we were campaigning for in the 70s. And what the Channel 4 has become almost another channel, which is exactly what we wanted to oppose. We wanted to create a channel that was not the BBC, not the ITV, and it was an independent channel in terms of content, in terms of orientation, in terms of narrative, in terms of access. But Channel 4 has become like those, and in some cases even worse, as the Benefit Street and the How to Get a Council House series about Tower Hamlets have shown, because Channel 4 has supported displacement of people, supported degeneration, and supported the taking away of people's housing rights. And so therefore Channel 4 has been breaching its own founding principles that we actually contributed to and supported in the 70s before it came into operation starting the 1980s. Now, what Tom Denning has done is to leave a legacy of reaction, denial of justice and fairness, and his successors have defied their various conventions. And Brexit, when they say, the Brexiteers say they're taking back control, they emphasize the human rights legislation that have been forced on the UK by the membership of international bodies, not the EU, but they confuse and conflate. So there is a lot of lying at every stage about the law, legality, constitution. The UK became a signatory to the what is called Treaty of Rome 1950, nothing to do with the European Union or the EEC or European Economic Community. What it was a part of the founding of the United Nations in the late 1940s, and to stop the scourge of war and massacres and all the rest of it. So the Treaty of Rome was the one that was instrumental in creating the need for signatory countries to pass legislation that became known as the Human Rights Conventions. This is what the little English racists resent the most. They don't want the racism to be tampered with, let alone replaced or reversed or abolished. They want the racism to be revived and strengthened. And the reason why Denning was embroiled in the racist kind of debacle in the last years and last months of his time as a senior judge was because he believed in the same racism that the racists of the Brexiteering brigade believe in. And the judiciary has not produced anything compatible with the main framework of the conventions, the charters, the agreements, and the declarations that I have referred to. So Britain is poorer. When I say Britain, the ordinary public are poorer in terms of rights now that they were in the late 1940s, 1950s. And the so-called opposition Labour Party, I mean, when Michael Foot was leader temporarily, I observed Michael Foot from close quarters, very close quarters. I attended many events that he spoke at, and I found no evidence that this was a socialist, revolutionary, enlightened person. I did the same with Tony Benn, and the same applies. So these are the two of the heavyweight, quote, left-wing socialist, anti-capitalist, supposedly, that identified with the Labour Party. Nothing. And the same applies to, as I said, the garden gnome, I call him, Jeremy Corbyn. And even Robin Cook, who was the foreign secretary, the first foreign secretary, I think, when Blair took over, and he claimed to start the ethical foreign policy. Robin Cook, too, was not ethical enough. So, what I'm saying is that the Labour Party may be in control in party card, number, and formalities, but it is not providing to the British public or the people in Britain an alternative in terms of the accountability, democracy, fairness, access to the courts. And the Labour Party has not made any headlines, not made any waves about the decline or the absence of any legal redress in this country. And the same goes with Corbyn not talking about the police. We are not talking about the police as individuals in the sense that we are naming somebody, but individuals are part of the institution. And the culture of unaccountability, the rampant culture of racism, has not been addressed by Jeremy Corbyn. And it goes to cover everything. So back to Neom Council, and they didn't send any person to appear at the staged hearing at the tribunal on the 11th of September 2017. Now, this is September the 5th. So, 17, 18, 19, 20, the 3 years ago. And for 3 years, Denning has been proven as completely irrelevant because the lies perpetrated by Newham Council have been repeated by the tribunal at every stage. And because the target, the recipient of their injustice and lies, has had to defend their home at the same time as defending the right to the local housing allowance, they have not had literally the time to go to seek a certiorari or judicial review. And this is the reality of the absence of due process and natural justice that I am pointing out on the facts today, 5th of September 2020, and starting from the 11th of September 2017. And I shall be updating on the later stages of the tribunal of lies, because the tribunal stages were attempted or tried or tested by the person, the tenant, following the 11th of September 2017. And every single stage repeated the lies and disengaged from the real core of the question: has the council or has any employee of the council the right to tell lies? It's not about the law. It's about lying, inventing. There is no law that says that any person in the council has got any right to tell lies. So what we are talking about is now 10 minutes to 10 GMT now, and we shall be continuing the diagnosis of Fleet Street today in about 10 minutes. So whoever is watching this, wherever they're watching it, whenever they're watching this is an exclusive, original, investigative, analytical contribution and record. So anyone is welcome to use the information, provided they get the generosity of mind to recognize the source. It would help others as well to generously say that they saw it here on this KhoodeelaarTV channel and they heard it on that program from Muhammad Haque, which is the writer, the investigator, the author, the presenter of this particular program and this particular channel. And we shall be back about 10 or 10:15 in the GMT mode, time zone. Today, Saturday, the 5th of September 2020. And we shall continue the battle to expose the lies of the court system and the court system's colluders, the so-called fourth estate, the Fleet Street, and we shall comment on the unfitness of the UK House of Commons to represent the community, to claim to represent the community, as I said earlier. MPs can do whatever they like. They are not obliged to even correspond to constituents. So until about 25 minutes from now, this is 9 minutes to 10 GMT on Saturday, the 5th of September 2020.